a very broad movement with millions of followers. It has, over that time, definitely become more female, which is one point I like to emphasize. Women's issue has not played a major role at the outset. It was a lot about the national question. It was a lot about class struggle, which were the main pillars of the theoretical foundation, Marxist understanding of class struggle and national liberation. Women's question, gender question did not play a major role back then. That changed. The whole organization became more female in that sense. And as I said on the outset, there's a constant flux of organizational structures which is constantly changing. So this is the main thing I'm trying to explain. Some of this will stay on for a while, so you can slowly read it. I have tried to visualize a bit in the form of some flags and symbols that between 1978 and 1993, because from then there was a shift towards a negotiated solution. The first major unilateral ceasefire with the declared statement, we want actually a negotiated solution and we want to enter into talks with the Turkish government. Today we know that this was actually the response to a proposal by the then Turkish president, who had asked for a ceasefire and said, there could be some steps taken when there is a ceasefire. At that time, it was seen as a unilateral ceasefire. So we basically have Marxist-Leninist ideology there, coupled with more or less classical, we heard about neocolonialism or colonialism understanding this morning by Mr. Cameron Martin. This was part of it, more or less classical understanding of national liberation and situation in Kurdistan analyzed as a colonialist situation. The main strategy that was first propagated, like in theory when the organization was founded, was the strategy of a protracted people's war. This is probably the reason why still in some literature the PKK is shown as a Maoist organization. They have never been a Maoist organization, but they had this one element of a protracted people's war, which shows up in Maoist military theories. I think this is the reason why they're sometimes shown as Maoist. And the declared aim was, not as the final aim, but as one of the main propagated aims, in united independent socialist Kurdistan. Socialist was even then not imagined that it would immediately happen as soon as the war is won or anything, but like a long transition, first with establishing democratic regime somehow. And all this was even then thought of being part of a bigger change in the wider Middle East, with the ultimate aim of a Middle East federation. That's also already in the first party program of the PKK. It doesn't stop at liberating Kurdistan. The aim is to form, together with other socialist countries, Middle East federation, even back then. Now, practically all of this has changed. And this is the paradigm shift that I'm talking about, or that Ertuğrul Kürkçü was also talking about. There is, of course, still elements of Marxism in the discourse, and many of the categories in which society is analyzed are still very much Marxist. But very much, and this is why I'm so grateful about Cameron Martin's speech, practically all of what he said has been incorporated into the theoretical foundations of that movement. They've criticized all of this. They've criticized this understanding of modernity, this phase model, or this model of stages, saying, country must first become, capitalist before it can become socialist. So we have to develop a working class in Kurdistan. Never happened, was never really intended to, so it wasn't really applicable. They looked at the anti-colonial struggles that have been successful in a way, like because they formed new states in Africa or parts of Asia. Then looked at the outcome. Social liberation has almost nowhere really materialized. So taking all these things into account, they started a quite radical criticism of the theoretical foundations of this. Why has this happened? And part of this was to say, we've operated always with European categories, things that do not really apply to the Middle East, that do not really work here. We've used strategies from elsewhere and terms from elsewhere and modes of thinking from elsewhere that don't really work, and try to develop a theory and concepts that fit more into the actual situation of the Middle East. And the model they ultimately arrived at is this democratic confederalism, which is not to be confused with a confederation. This is not about, forming a confederation like Switzerland of 4 parts of Kurdistan, uniting them into one state, which is often misunderstood, sometimes intentionally misunderstood, to say, yeah, they still want a state, but only with a different name. It's a model for a democratic society that is organized, I'll come to this later, more in detail, which is organized in groups rather than in individuals. So you have religious organizations, professional organizations, ethnical organizations, all kinds of groups that then form a network or some kind of relationship, which then this network of relationships is what they call confederalism. This includes, of course, a cooperation between the different parts of Kurdistan, but definitely it is meant without changing the borders, like a cross-border cooperation or on different levels. And the important thing is to understand this as a bottom-up model, that you form locally groups and organizations and structures which then form confederations on different topics and things. So as opposed to a state model where some territories unite in a confederation to form yet another state. It's a completely different thing. It's actually quite the opposite. So this term is a bit misleading or misunderstandable. So I think it's important to emphasize this point. It's not to be confused with a confederation. One of the major shifts that occurred in the first half of the 2000s was a new military strategy of the movement, away from this protracted people's war with the imagination that an armed struggle could somehow liberate the country, could somehow throw the armies like the Turkish army out of the country, and then you have it liberated. This imagination proved very quickly actually to be not realistic. So that already in the late 80s, the discussion started that actually the role of the armed struggle has to be defined otherwise, more like making propaganda, raising the issue, putting this issue onto the international agenda, and raising, before everything else, the national awareness and having a resurrection of Kurdish national thinking, of self-esteem, a re-establishing of self-esteem as a resisting nation, especially in the Turkish part of Kurdistan, because there the self-esteem or the self-understanding as Kurdish was probably repressed the most. The direction of the ideological thinking is definitely anti-statist. It's not only that, maybe something more autonomous and less a state. It's definitely anti-statist, and this is why this whole thinking, all these concepts are an alternative to the approach of most of the Kurdish national movement in South Kurdistan, which is most of it is thinking quite differently on that. So it's actually meant and formulated as an alternative to that. Democratic autonomy is more or less another way of expressing this organizational model of the democratic confederalism, or to spell it out as, for instance, the Democratic Toplum Kongresi, the Democratic Society Congress in Turkey, has done a model that is developed more. Feminism has become a very important part of the thinking of the movement, reflecting in the definition and the discussion on how freedom, if you're a liberation movement, you have to have an understanding of what freedom you're talking about, what liberation you're talking about. And one of the core definitions is to say if the women are not free, Kurdistan is not free. You can have your border, you can have your flag, you can have your own government, but if it is still a very patriarchal and a very repressive society for women, plus other sexual groups like homosexuals or all kinds of gender identities, then you don't have a free society, and thus you don't have a free Kurdistan. It's not defined over the territory or the way of how it's being governed, but over the level of freedom in the society. And the other one, came up as a quote also in the early 2000s, referring to South Kurdistan, of course, because what Mr. Reimar Heider presented yesterday was basically the explanation of a very corrupt and repressive form of governing the society. To say if this torturer speaks Kurdish now, that's not freedom. It's just some things have changed if that's the case, but the society has not become a free society, and thus Kurdistan has not become a free Kurdistan. Several of the speakers yesterday, Brian Curran and Alex Maskey, referred to a common vision that is important to be developed for, if you want, you have to share a common goal in negotiations so both sides can work for that goal. I think the Kurdish movement has tried several times to develop such a vision. For instance, in 1999, when Öcalan spoke about the Democratic Republic, this was actually meant as a possible vision that people in Turkey, all people in Turkey, could share, to work to remove the deficits of the existing republic and form a more democratic republic, which has different identities, room for different identities, different languages, all these things. It hasn't really materialized. This is not the vision that many people have, jumped upon and said, yeah, this is, and we are working for this together. But it was certainly meant as such a thing. So the attempt to form exactly such a vision that also other peoples can identify with has been made by the Kurdish movement. The way yesterday it was also described by, I think Cengiz Güneş, who said KCK was meant as a framework for an institution framework for the movement. I think that's a very good description of this. What is actually what the movement is trying to create, as far as I understand it, and how they spell out this concept of a democratic nation, democratic autonomy, is is an organized society which is organized in multiple ways according to gender, ethnic, religious, class, professional, other characteristics. And by building such a self-government and self-determination, realizing self-determination in this way, forming an alternative model to the state and not an alternative state. This is how KCK is discussed in court today. The courts say, you are trying to create a parallel state, and this is separatism. While actually what they are trying to do is to create an alternative to the state. Do things that the state just doesn't do, like Kurdish education. Okay, the state doesn't give it to you. Okay, organize it yourself. This doesn't mean to attack the state militarily or with armed action or whatever. It's a or the way they are trying to run the municipalities is just an alternative. They're trying to run Diyarbakir differently from Izmir, and more participation of the people, try different models, make it multilingual. This is challenging for the state. This is challenging the existing way the state is being run, but it's not an alternative state. They're not trying to form another state. What I also think is important to understand, that this is model which takes different forms in different countries. Certainly in Syria, this is probably being much differently discussed than in Turkey today, in West Kurdistan and North Kurdistan. But it's meant as an answer to the problems that all the nation states have in the Middle East. The Arabic nation states, or the so-called nation states, because Syria is not really defined as an Arabic republic, but it's also a multi-ethnic state. Iran is a multi-ethnic state. It's not a nation state in the strict sense that is being enforced. Like the Turkish nationalism has created a Turkish nation state, and Arab nationalism has created Arabic national states, which do not really reflect the reality of the societies in these countries. So this whole thing is meant as an offer for other peoples as well to organize this way and propose as a solution to many problems that the societies in these countries have. Okay. So why am I, as a representative of the Freedom of Öcalan initiative, why I'm speaking about these topics? The driving force behind this shift in the discourse in the Kurdish movement and in forming many of those organizations that you've seen the symbols of is, of course, Öcalan. He, in general, has been good in thinking very long-term and in developing strategies. He developed basically all the basic outlines for all the strategies that the Kurdish movement had, whether it was, to, in 73, think about, starting an armed struggle, an anti-colonialist movement, which then materialized in 84, or be it civil society grassroots-centered model that he had in his defense speech in Imrale at 99, which now, 10, 12 years later, we are seeing to materialize in several parts of Kurdistan. So he has been very strategic in thinking and very long-term in his analysis. I think, is my theory, he has been acting as a catalyst in such a way. He gave very much importance while he was in Lebanon and Syria to meet as many people as possible, to get in touch with as many people as possible from the Kurdish society. If possible, all the militants that joined the organizations were channeled somehow through the places where he was, so he could educate them, he could get to know them, and could get in touch with parts of the society. He was not very able to move very much, so he couldn't just go everywhere, but he tried to understand what was going on in society. And he tried to take this up, understand this, and develop politics and strategies according to that. So that's what I mean with catalyst in that sense. Many of the changes that he initiated initially faced a lot of resistance. Some examples for this, when he put it was him, one has to be honest on that. It was not a women's organization in the PKK. It was him who set the women's question on the agenda initially and opened up space for the women to organize separately. This was faced with a huge resistance by the men in the organization, saying, "No, there's no need for a women's organization or a separate, women's army and these things." And he created the space so that the women could organize themselves, develop their own theory, own organizational structures, and become an important force in the movement, and took over an important role in the movement. Other changes are the first ceasefire was not, many people did not find that a very good idea. The withdrawal from Turkey of the guerrilla in 1999 was not found a very good idea by many people. It faced a huge resistance initially, and one could give many more examples in this direction, but he has managed to convince people. One of the ways he convinced people what he could do in prison was writing. He wrote a total of actually 13 books. One of them has never come out. Nobody knows what's in it. It has been confiscated by the government, so we say it's 12 books that he wrote in prison. That was the major means, his writings were the major means of transforming this movement. Many people have actually read them. One of them, I have the numbers of, has actually sold in Turkey more than 100,000 copies. So this is not some marginal, organizational internal literature. People actually know, if they want to know what he's talking about. And these have been very instrumental in transforming the discourse in the movement. And what I find, and what we are, as the initiative, are talking most about, is of course that he's, due to his role in the organization and due to the authority he has in the Kurdish society, he is the key figure for the peace process. Not only has he initiated all the peace initiatives of the Kurdish movement, but he's recognized also by the other side as the key person. They were not readily admitting this for a very long time, but now that the details about the Oslo talks have leaked out, it is clear that they held talks on practically the highest levels directly with him. He was involved in all. That's why actually in the documents of this Oslo process, they call it Oslo-Imrale process. They don't call it Oslo process. They call it Oslo-Imrale process because everything was coordinated between Kandil, Imrale, and the Turkish government in the form of the intelligence service, of course. But even before that, every time that there was a ceasefire, which has, covertly been negotiated with the state, he was involved in all of that. More important, we're talking about the transition of the movement, basically. He has made it peace ready. And he was the one who had, against all, some people probably remember the situation in 1999, where everybody thought about escalating the war. There were even decisions of the PKK, which were in Congress when he was abducted from Kenya. They were just holding the Congress. And the decisions there were all about escalating the war. And they were actually like binding decisions to escalate the war on all fronts and create a terrible chaos in Turkey. That were Congress decisions. And they were, he managed to, similar to what he did with the hunger strike today. He managed to say, no, stop this. Right now the ceasefire that was in place should continue. We're dealing with this differently, and has subsequently managed to convince people of his approach, a strategy to make the movement peace ready. That's how I call it, my term. I didn't elaborate on the military strategy on the former slide. There was this shift from this protracted people's war to a strategy of legitimate defense, to say, okay, we don't abolish, the armed struggle like completely, like we keep our arms until we have some guarantee that some changes irrevocably be happening. But we're not seeing this military action as a means to, liberate a territory or whatever, invade a city or, throw the army out here and there. But it's defined since 2005 or so, I think, as a military action only to remove obstacles from the political process. So since 1999, the political process is the main thing, and the guerrilla that for a long time had been the primary focus of the whole movement has actually become the second in line, and is only instrumental or defined as instrumental for removing obstacles from the political process. Whether this is always the case, how good this works, and whether this could be handled differently is maybe another issue. But I think this is a very, very serious shift for a movement that does armed struggle that cannot be overestimated. Another important point of this is, of course, that because of this, he has the practically full support of the movement, so he's unchallenged as a negotiations leader for this, past or further negotiations. And this is actually what the hunger strike was talking about. The hunger strike is when they said, remove his isolation. It was not only that he has that the terrible conditions that he's living in are alleviated, so he has it better, but because this is instrumental for coming to a solution of the whole issue. That's why his isolation must be lifted, so he can speak and act, basically. I'm very, very shortly going only over this. This is don't go much into detail what has happened actually, because also not the topic of my speech. Just to underline a bit his role in all this. The talks took place between the MIT, Öcalan, PKK, and Congolese representatives. This is all like as far as we know. This is the stuff that has leaked through the press and has not been denied by either sides. So this is what we can know. Apart from that, there's nothing very special that I know. It's just what is actually public. We've collected it a little bit together, the bits and pieces, to be able to present this. The talks went in parallel. There was this famous protocol agreed on. That was not the only thing that was agreed on, of course, but this was the only thing that leaked. So it's the only thing that we know of. And finally, it broke down because Erdogan said, okay, maybe my negotiators have agreed on that, but I don't approve of it. So that was how it ended. Different discussion. This is the text of this protocol that leaked. I just want to draw the attention on some of the points. They refer to 3 documents that are called Draft of Principles of Democratic Solution to Main Social Problems in Turkey, very clumsy title. Draft of Principles of Just Peace and Relations between the State and the Society in Turkey, and Draft for the Democratic Solution of the Kurdish Question and Action Plan for Just Peace. These are documents that have been discussed on, that both sides, like in principle, agreed on, and that would be elaborated at, and the issues in that would be taken up in them. They were all written by him. So it's not that, people in Kandil presented something, he presented something, the state presents something, but the outline, the stuff that has been discussed about, has been written by him. he made the suggestion in this draft, as you can see in point 4, for a constitutional council, because all this thing was about how through a new constitution this problem should be resolved. That was agreed on. That there had in future to be peace and a peace council, like dealing with the demilitarization of the conflict, and a justice commission or truth and justice commissions. They have been discussed a lot. Brian Curran referred to them after the model of South Africa, which may be something that happens later. Point 5 is quite interesting because they agreed on that after the elections of June 2011, 2 members, high-ranking members of the organizations would actually be able to visit Öcalan and Imrali. So this shows how far this actually went, that they can be transported there and going back without the public knowing. So this shows the level of these talks. This is that the operation should be ended, some KGK prisoners would be released. All didn't happen. From this we can see, just as a footnote, all this was agreed on in May. The elections were in June. None of these things happened. And then in July, later in July, the clashes started again. So it's very wrong to say, some incident on the 14th of July, like in Silvan, was the reason for the talks to break down. They had broken down because nothing was implemented. Erdogan said, I don't do it. And weeks after that, the first clashes started again, just as a footnote. Well, one can see this later. Most of the proposals that Öcalan made and that were being discussed and agreed on in this have actually been outlined by him in his roadmap. That's why we found it very important to translate this very quickly and publish it. It's available also here as a book. It was written when the serious talks started. There were contacts from 2006 on, but in 2009 the contact started seriously. As I understand it, the MIT said, what are your positions? Outline us your positions. What are we going to talk about? And then he said, okay, I'll write this in a big roadmap. And in this, you can actually find all these points that have been agreed on like 2 years later. This is his outline, this is his vision. From that, you can get an understanding what he means when he talks about democratic autonomy or confederalism. So it's a very crucial document we find. Why are we talking about Öcalan when we talk about peace process? He has the mass support. This is probably undisputed. He has proven his capabilities to lead all kinds of enterprises, like to lead this organization, to lead such a process, to lead talks with the government. So you can kind of rely on him when you talk with him. He has the necessary authority to also make compromises, because when you make a negotiated solution, you have to make compromises. You have to give up some positions in the end. At some point, you have to give up the armed struggle. So you need such an authority who can say, okay, this is now the right time to stop a hunger strike or to stop the armed struggle or to, lay down the arms or whatever. Very important. One understands that he's actually not coming up with maximalist demands, but actually quite reasonable and moderate solution proposals, where I said, he's trying to form a vision that also Turkey can buy in on and agree to. So very important in this, and this is actually something that the other side doesn't really do. Erdogan doesn't develop a vision for how he wants a Turkey where this issue is resolved. So this is one of the major problems, as several of the speakers pointed out. Now all this has been answered since July 2011 with an increased and aggravated isolation. Some of the details of which are here. For 10 years he was the only prisoner. Now it's a Kurdish prison island with only Kurdish prisoners from 2 different organizations. It's guarded by more than 1,000 soldiers. Impressive number, I think. But the crucial point was also in the hunger strike, there's no contact with lawyers since end of July. And most of his lawyers are in prison since November 2011. So this efforts for a peaceful solution were answered with isolation and repression. Why is this happening? This is actually an old caricature. It's from 1999 or 2000, but it's still very, very current about what is happening. Whenever you see people challenging these things, saying the opposite, saying, no, he's no longer important for the movement. or he's actually incapable of leading the movement because there are so many factions who are against him, or people are trying to sabotage what he's actually saying. You know, he says something, PKK does something else, or in some way are challenging these things. What these people are doing is they are trying to suffocate the peace process. They're not interested in a solution. Can understand this, you know, be it a journalist or a politician, whoever says these things, I would say, want to suffocate the peace process. The aim of this repression, this massive repression, why we have 10,000 political prisoners now, is, of course, to impede, to stop them building up these alternative structures that I've been talking about. They want to stop this experiment with confederalism, with democratic autonomy. That's the aim of this repression. This is why it gets so much, it is attacked so much. The same in Syria. You know, people are there, the Kurds, they are also experimenting with, not experimenting, but they're trying to you know, organize as a society according to these ideas, and Turkey wants to suffocate this, want to attack this. This is why they are so trying to repress. Reimar will talk more on this, I guess. Maybe he has some other opinion, I don't know. And of course, an inherent result of this is that progressive tendencies, I would call progressive, are suppressed, and at the same time, the opposite of them are supported. That would be Kurdish nationalism, Kurdish Islamism, or all kinds of other repressive things. So this is the reason why, okay, we just deleted some of the words. You know, our campaign, everybody knows it. This is why we find it important that Öcalan and the political prisoners are freed, so that a real process, a real solution can start. There's no peace process at the moment to speak of, but we find one is necessary. This is why we are running this campaign. Just one sentence, last minute, and it's my last slide. It's a future transformation. I talked about the transformation that already happened. There are, of course, some that we can discuss about in the discussion now that will at some point or should at some point happen. There should, of course, be some real peace process to speak of. There is no such thing yet, unfortunately. Could have happened in 2009 if Erdogan had said, great, these people are coming from Habur, and people in Diyarbakir are happy because peace is coming, the war is ended. If he had said this, we would today be at some very different point. But we don't have this peace process, but it has to happen. There has to be a demilitarization of the conflict, whatever that means. I mean, there has been some restructuring. Probably at some point the guerrilla will no longer exist or will be transformed in something else. That will happen. And, of course, one can discuss and think about legalization. Everybody knows in South Africa, it was one announcement. De Klerk said, today we will release Mandela, and from today on, the ANC, the Communist Party, and the Pan-African Congress are legal. That was one announcement that happened together in South Africa, and this is how the peace process there seriously started in 91. From the position of the Kurdish movement, I think things that will change is there will be an increased responsibility for social issues. The movement is running municipalities now in Turkey. It is running a whole strip of land in Syria, in western Kurdistan. So issues that had not been an issue before become now important, like, you know, providing health care, all kinds of social issues. The focus in the future will shift more than it's now to East Kurdistan, Iran, as it has now shifted to Syria. It will stay there probably for a while, but at some future point it will probably shift more to Iran and East Kurdistan, and also to South Kurdistan, and some kind of cooperation. The movement is very keen on actually building a real national strategy with all Kurdish parties, including KDP and PUK. So there has to be some form of cooperation more in the future. I'm ending here. Thank you very much, and please support our campaign.
Thank you, Reimar, for that insight into the Kurdish national movement.